Welcome to One Big Boat. We're all in this together. A show focused on people and organizations whose work is making a true difference in people's lives. Today, we welcome aboard Audra Parker of Save Our Sound, the Alliance to Save Nantucket Sound. She's on board to tell us why she's fighting to have Nantucket Sound be recognized as a national landmark. That's next on One Big Boat. We're all in this together.
So I was asked by the Museum of Science a long time ago to shoot all sides or get all sides of the Cape Wind crisis, as you called it. And I interviewed Cape Wind, I interviewed the Audubon, and I remember driving to your house thinking, this is not in my backyard. And then you wowed me. So why don't we go back to, why did you start your campaign against Cape Wind and how this all started? And then we'll get into today, what you're doing today.
So the organization was started by commercial fishermen, marina owners, and it was really a grassroots effort to try to stop an offshore wind developer from building like a massive project in the center of Nantucket Sound. I got involved through a neighbor of mine that asked if I might want to job share with her. So we decided to basically job share and help support fundraising for the organization. I'd never worked for a nonprofit before, and as I got into it, I just got more and more excited about the mission, and fast forward 20 years later, I'm still there and leading the organization.
Yeah, but your situation was such that single mom, 4 kids, degree from Brown, degree from MIT, you could have done something that made you a lot more money. Well, why was this a passion of yours?
So I had worked in for-profit before. I worked in management consulting. I worked for a software company, but my husband had recently been diagnosed with brain cancer. And I was watching 4 young children. So I really needed something that was local and flexible. And I wasn't really even looking. The opportunity just presented itself. And I really loved the mission. The more I understood about it, the more I really loved the mission. And I had grown up spending summers on the Cape and really wanted to protect the area. And, NIMBY is a derogatory term, but if you are not going to protect the community in which you live, who is?
And what was the main issue you had with them?
There were a lot of issues. Basically, it was a very conflicted location. And so the developer had come in and decided that because the center of Nantucket Sound is federal water, there was sort of this hole in the donut. And it was ideal from a development perspective, from a profit maximization perspective, in that it was close to shore, it was protected by Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket. So it was the place where he would make the most money. But it wasn't good for the community. It wasn't good for stakeholders. It presented risks to public safety, air traffic control, marine navigation. It was sacred, and still is, a sacred tribal site. So it had historic and tribal impacts. It was very, very expensive, so it would have increased electric rates. From any stakeholder perspective, it was the worst possible site, and stakeholders had not been consulted. There was no process in place at the time. It was just the developer going, great area, here's a loophole, I'm going to make a lot of money, with no regard to the local community and to the stakeholders.
And for people who may not be familiar, why is that? It seems like that would be Massachusetts water. That would be Massachusetts, because we have our islands around there and stuff.
It is the only place in the continental United States that is like this, where you have federal waters in the center of Nantucket Sound, surrounded by a 3-mile ring of state waters that are part of Massachusetts Ocean Sanctuary System. And those 3 miles run from the shores of the Cape and Islands. And it's essentially because the distance between the north side of Nantucket and the south side of Chatham or Monomoy is 8 miles. And the rule of thumb is that it's a 3-mile boundary. So there's a little 2-mile section that opens up and makes the center federal water. If you look at Cape Cod Bay on the north side, because it's one contiguous landform, state waters are cut just across from the tip of P-Town across to the mainland, and that's all state waters. But because of that small opening, it introduces federal waters in the center surrounded by state water. So it's one ecosystem, but it's fractured jurisdiction between the federal government and the state government.
And that was poorly planned out. Also, it was going to be a huge eyesore for people, right? That was part of your campaign.
I think, yes, there were, I think the emotional response to people that did not want this project was a reaction to this large-scale development in what otherwise is a pristine natural environment. But there were so many more issues beyond that. Like I said, the tribal aspect, the historic aspect, public safety, it's not without negative environmental impacts as well. So again, it's just like on land where you have areas that are commercially zoned, residentially zoned, and areas that are protected as open space. Sort of the same thing there. Yeah, it's in the water, but it's not truly offshore because it's an area that's surrounded by three bodies of land.
And just so people know, you're a client of ours here at Last Minute Productions, and we've done a few projects with you, and they've actually been eye-opening to me. We did one where a lot of people might think it's just an eyesore, right? But also just protecting that land, protecting that seascape, if you will. There's so much more to it, isn't there? And why don't we get into what you're trying to do now? Cape Wind is no longer.
Right. So after a 18-year, very long, very intense, and very expensive battle, Cape Wind finally went by the wayside in 2018 officially. But that same situation with that split jurisdiction between the federal water and the state water still exists today. So we did a lot of stakeholder outreach to determine what's the best way of protecting this body of water as one ecosystem across both state and federal water, and determine that a National Historic Landmark is the best way to go. So National Historic Landmark is the highest level of historic protection and largely would recognize the fact that Nantucket Sound is considered a sacred tribal site and leverages a 2010 decision by the Department of Interior that ruled that Nantucket Sound is indeed a tribal site. It's considered a traditional cultural place because of its significance to the Wampanoag people. So we're leveraging that to increase the level of protection and designate it as a National Historic Landmark.
How much did you learn about the Wampanoags and everything throughout this whole process? Because I learned a little and was fascinated.
It is fascinating. I mean, I would say, to be honest, I know less about their history than I have developed a relationship with some of the tribal leaders, the chair people, as well as the tribal historic preservation officers over the years, and just the passion and the love and the importance of Nantucket Sound is just incredible to me. So it has been eye-opening. The whole experience, just understanding the perspective of the commercial fishermen, understanding the perspective of the tribes, the airport commissions, ferry operators, just pretty much any one of the many, many people that use and value Nantucket Sound.
And probably the heaviest regulated group in our country is probably fishermen. And so they had a lot to lose. They have a lot to lose if somebody builds out there.
Yeah, they're really incredible. I remember we must have gone to 50 plus hearings over the years that Cape Wind was being permitted, whether it was Army Corps of Engineers or Mineral Management Service at that time. And the fishermen would always make time to go to the hearings and protect their fishing grounds. It was really, and at the expense of their livelihoods. They're really quite incredible.
Yeah, but you guys, and just to be clear, you're not against wind power. Right.
No, it's a matter of being appropriately cited. So as I was explaining, with Cape Wind, they came in before there was any kind of framework for citing these projects. And in fact, as a result of the protracted battle over Cape Wind, the Department of Interior introduced a program called Smart from the Start, where they looked at basically GIS maps and looked at, is it essential fish habitat? Is it a migratory bird flyway? Are there navigational channels? And they kind of layered these maps to identify areas that would have fewer conflicts. And then they took those areas and they had public hearings, and people could come in and comment and say, okay, that might not be an essential fish habitat, but I'm a commercial fisherman and I actually fish there. So they winnowed these areas down to try to find areas they could lease that would be far less conflicted. And of course, there are no locations that are without conflicts, but the idea was, let's try to expedite renewable energy development by minimizing the conflicts to stakeholders. And that's in fact what's happened, largely as a result of the battle over Cape Wind.
Are there things happening where pollutants are getting into our oceans, and that this, if it becomes a national landmark, would help with that?
It's more of a recognition. I mean, there is diminished water quality, and you do see obviously environmental issues facing Nantucket Sound, as you do many bodies of water. But this particular designation would more recognize Nantucket Sound's rich tribal history, and it's a level of recognition. And as I said before, it's the highest level of historic protection possible. So if there's any action going forward, the federal government, the rule of thumb or the legal standard would be the federal government would have to avoid negative impacts to the maximum extent possible. So it's a means of protecting kind of the integrity in this national natural resource.
Coming up,
The turbine blade, well, it
Yeah.
basically split up into pieces, and that debris washed up on the beaches, so it could potentially create public safety impacts.
we discuss the latest issue to wash ashore on the islands.
So throughout the year, what does your calendar look like? What are you doing?
What do I do personally?
Yeah, like you're going to Washington.
Yeah, Washington, lobbying, a lot of fundraising. We're privately funded by mostly local Cape and Islands residents. So a lot of fundraising, a lot of community outreach. We do some educational programs. We do a monthly webinar called A Celebration of Nantucket Sound, where we have an expert come in and talk about some aspect of Nantucket Sound. It could be tribal history, it could be squid, it could be lighthouses, it could be horseshoe crabs, and that's been pretty popular. But largely, I'm spending my time with outreach, community outreach, fundraising, and lobbying. We are trying to seek this National Historic Landmark designation two ways. One is administratively through the U.S. Department of the Interior, and specifically National Park Service. So that requires a lot of research and documentation on why Nantucket Sound is nationally significant and how it meets the criteria that the National Park Service would use to determine what is a National Historic Landmark. And then right now we're spending a lot of time on a legislative path to that National Historic Landmark designation. And in fact, we have an online petition going now, and we're urging people that support permanent protection of Nantucket Sound to go online and sign a petition to urge our legislators to introduce what's called the Nantucket Sound National Historic Landmark Act.
What's the opposition?
There really isn't any opposition. I think it's just a matter of priorities. There's a lot of issues facing every community, and what's the priority? So I think it's just getting a champion and getting attention. There's so much information out there. It's like really fighting through that to get people to understand why this is important. Just as the Cape Cod National Seashore was protected over 50 years ago, it was a lasting legacy. It's the same thing now. Do this for Nantucket Sound. We have an opportunity to protect this body of water for future generations and leave a really important legacy.
Yeah, and it sounds like this is something that could just kind of fade into the background. People don't really pay much attention to it. And then something washes up on the shore in Nantucket.
Yeah, so that's a good point. There's been a recent blade failure from a wind project south of the islands that ended up having, as you said, debris washing ashore. And similar situations have happened off the coast of England with the same turbine blade. And that has actually created a lot of attention and urgency to our mission, showing that renewable energy is important, but it's very important to properly site these projects. And Nantucket Sound, surrounded by Cape Cod, Nantucket, and Martha's Vineyard, is certainly the worst place to site a project of that scale and size, and that could potentially have that type of an impact.
So other than it being something pretty big and heavy you got to pick up, right? What does it do? What potentially did it do?
The turbine blade, well, it
Yeah.
basically split up into pieces. It's not one single blade, and it's, I don't remember the size, but hundreds of feet long, and that debris washed up on the beaches, so it could potentially create public safety impacts. Anecdotally, I've been told by a few people that swimming, they had shards in their skin, again, anecdotally, but I think it was just the fact that it's debris, and debris is kind of difficult to find and pick up in the waters.
Is it one manufacturer?
It is one manufacturer that of these 3 blade incidents, it is. There were 2 off a project called Dogger Bank in England and 1 off the Vineyard Wind Project. And they're all supposedly different reasons that they failed, but the same manufacturer.
Yeah. And for you, a person who's running a nonprofit, and you actually have like, if somebody's doing something for foster children, there's always going to be foster children, right? But you have an end zone. And you might get into that end zone if it's a national landmark. Then what? And what do you know, what's Audra Parker? And by the way, Audra, and people should know that your first name means storm in Lithuanian.
It does.
Which is ironic, given what
and appropriate.
Yes.
Yeah. I might add. Yeah.
So what are you doing there? If you do
I don't know. I'm really very goal oriented, and I was thrilled when we were able to defeat Cape Wind with all the support of the local community and all the stakeholders. So this would be. I would just consider it a major accomplishment when we get this National Historic Landmark designation. What that holds beyond for me, or if I do something else, I don't know. I've been doing this for a long, long time, but I want to get to that. I want to get to that end goal. It's important. It's important to me personally, and it's important to the Cape and Islands.
I would just go out in a beach chair.
And enjoy Nantucket Sound?
Yes, I would just, I'd get a pizza delivered and drink and just like celebrate.
Every day for 3 months.
Well, I don't know how long I could do every day for. But how do people get involved? How do people get to know more?
People can go to our website at saveoursound.org. And if they would love to sign our petition, we would love that. And that is saveoursound.org/petition. And it's very simple. You just basically put in your email, your name, and your town. And there you are. You are signing a petition to urge our federal legislators to introduce legislation to permanently protect Nantucket Sound as a National Historic Landmark.
Just that easy.
That's easy. Yep.
Anything else you need to tell people?
No, that's it. I'm always happy to talk to anyone that wants to listen to me and our cause.
House party, won't you?
So sure.
Yeah, and talk to people.
Sure.
With slides and everything.
Yeah, or any organization that people are involved in.
Great for kids' parties.
Well, I don't know about that. If anyone has wants to speak on some aspect of Nantucket Sound, as I said, we have this monthly webinar series, a celebration of Nantucket Sound, and I am more than happy for people to contact me directly. It's Audra at saveoursound.org, and if people want to help by spreading the word, by donating, or by signing the petition, that would be very much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One Big Boat is a production of Last Minute Productions, Incorporated. This episode was produced by Jay Dobeck. Ethan Gallo was the sound engineer. Gary Gillis, Jim Johnston, and Scott Wyman provided production support. And Joanne Pilata was the production coordinator.